Canada just made a decision that could permanently change the balance of power in North American trade, and most people haven't fully grasped how big this actually is. We're not talking about a policy adjustment or a budget line. We're talking about a country deliberately dismantling an 80-year economic dependency and building an entirely new foundation from scratch. Stay with me, because the numbers alone will change how you see this story. And if you've been following this channel, you already know we track this daily. So drop a comment right now and tell me, do you think Canada can actually pull this off? For decades, Canada sent roughly 75% of everything it exported to one single country, the United States. Not 30%, not 50%, 75%. According to Statistics Canada, that concentration was so extreme that every Canadian industry, from auto parts to agriculture to steel, was effectively held hostage to whatever mood Washington happened to be in on any given morning. And for a long time, that was fine. The United States was a stable, rules-following partner. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement governed trade with legal certainty. Factories on both sides of the border fed each other in a supply chain so integrated it moved $2.5 billion in goods and services across that border every single day. It was called the most comprehensive and dynamic trading relationship in the world. Then Donald Trump came back, and within months, that 80-year partnership began cracking at the foundation. Tariffs landed on Canadian steel, aluminum, auto parts, and agricultural goods. And the message wasn't just economic, it was existential. The rules of the game had fundamentally changed. Now here's what I want you to think about as we go deeper. If your single biggest customer suddenly started treating you like a competitor, how fast could you find new ones? Because that is exactly the problem Canada found itself solving, but at a national scale, with trillions of dollars on the line. In his first major speech as Prime Minister, Mark Carney said something that stopped even veteran diplomats cold. He didn't soften it. He didn't hedge it. He said the system of global trade anchored on the United States, the system Canada had relied on since the end of the Second World War, was over. The 80-year period in which the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect, and championed free and open trade, was over. Those are not the words of a politician playing it safe. Those are the words of a former central banker who has spent his career watching nations navigate systemic shocks and who recognized that Canada was standing inside one right now. Carney is not a man known for theatrics. So when someone like him uses language like that in a prime ministerial address, the world pays attention. And what he announced next is the part of this story that almost nobody outside Canada is talking about in full. Hit that subscribe button if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, because we break these down daily, and the next chapter of this one is already unfolding. The Carney government outlined a plan to mobilize $1 trillion in total investment over the next 5 years. Not government spending alone, a coordinated mobilization of public capital, private investment, institutional funding, and provincial partnership, all pointed in a single direction. Budget 2025 set the foundation with the stated goal of building the strongest economy in the G7. Over 5 years, the government's capital investments and incentives totaling around $280 billion are expected to unlock more than $1 trillion in total investment from public, private, and institutional partners. That breaks down to roughly $315 billion in infrastructure, $270 billion in industrial development, $210 billion in research and development, $130 billion in housing, $95 billion through tax incentives, and $60 billion through accelerated depreciation and expensing. This is not a stimulus package. This is a national reinvention. and the speed at which it's being attempted is unlike anything Canada has tried in the modern era. But here's the tension hiding inside all of that ambition, and it's the tension that will determine whether this plan succeeds or collapses under its own weight. We'll get to it. But first, you need to understand the weapon Carney built to make all of this possible. At the core of Canada's strategy is a new entity that most international observers have barely registered, the Major Projects Office. And once you understand what it does, you'll understand why it might be the single most important policy decision Carney has made. Canada has historically been one of the most difficult countries on Earth to build a major project in. Environmental assessments, Indigenous consultations, interministerial bureaucracy, provincial-federal overlap. Projects that should take 5 years were routinely taking 15 or 20. Investors walked. Projects died before they ever broke ground. The Major Projects Office was designed to eliminate that paralysis. Its mandate is to streamline approvals, support Indigenous consultations, attract investor capital, and coordinate labor supply across the entire life cycle of a nation-building project. Carney announced 12 projects fast-tracked for approval, a combined $116 billion in investment. Among them, the Quesnel LNG project in British Columbia, a massive liquefied natural gas export terminal designed to open Asian energy markets to Canadian supply. The Crawford Nickel project in Timmins, Ontario, one of the largest nickel reserves in the world, projected to produce 240,000 tons of ore per day, expected to create 4,000 new careers, with emissions 90% below the global average. Critical mineral mines in New Brunswick, hydro projects in the Arctic, port expansions on both coasts, and trade corridors connecting Canada's interior to open water. Carney put it plainly, the number one focus was to build, not study it, not commission reports about it, build it. Now here is where the story gets genuinely radical, and where Canada's policy establishment made a break from decades of free trade orthodoxy that surprised even its allies. For as long as most Canadians can remember, the governing assumption of trade policy was simple: buy from whoever is cheapest, regardless of nationality. That is the logic of free trade globalization. Carney tore that playbook apart. He announced that Canadian public procurement, federal agencies, crown corporations, every dollar of government spending, would now be redirected toward domestic economic stimulus. The reasoning was blunt. Canada had been following the rules of a free trade order that no longer existed, and the government was going to stop pretending otherwise. The Buy Canadian pivot was paired with a dramatic expansion of the Regional Tariff Response Initiative, originally budgeted at $450 million, now doubled to $1 billion, to help small and medium-sized businesses caught in the crossfire of the trade war. Up to 50,000 workers were connected to a new reskilling package funded through employers and recruitment companies, because Carney understood something many politicians skip over entirely. You cannot transform an economy without transforming the workforce inside it. The workers who built auto parts for Detroit cannot automatically pivot to operating LNG terminals or working critical mineral mines. You have to train them, fund that transition, and do it fast enough that real people don't fall through the gap between the old economy and the new one. The build communities. Strong Fund committed $51 billion over 10 years, followed by $3 billion annually on an ongoing basis, investing in hospitals, universities, roads, bridges, water systems, and transit infrastructure across the country. At least 20% of provincial funding allocations were designated for rural, northern, and Indigenous communities. At least 10% of the direct delivery stream was committed to Indigenous-led projects. This is a deliberate acknowledgement that the communities most economically marginalized in Canada are also the communities sitting on top of its most valuable natural resources. If Canada is going to build a new economic identity on critical minerals and clean energy, those communities need to be partners, not bystanders. But the most geopolitically explosive chapter of this story isn't about procurement policy or infrastructure permitting. It's about what happened when Canada decided to go to Asia. Carney traveled to China and met with President Xi Jinping. A deal was reached. Not a full free trade agreement, but a restoration of economic relationships disrupted by the tariff war. The agreement reinstated the pre-tariff status quo on select goods, including canola and electric vehicles. It was a signal to the world that Canada was done waiting for Washington to be in a good mood. Trump's reaction was immediate. He threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods and accused Canada of becoming a transit port for Chinese products flooding into the United States. He posted publicly that the last thing the world needed was China taking over Canada. Canadian ministers acknowledged the threat was serious, and then said it only confirmed why the diversification strategy had to continue. Even Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, not a political ally of Carney's, issued a statement acknowledging that Trump's threats represented a further degradation of the free and fair trade system Canada had taken for granted for decades, and that Canada must continue to be pragmatic in dealing with other partners. The political divide inside Canada narrowed sharply when the external threat sharpened. Carney also announced a formal trade diversification strategy with a target that sounds almost impossible from where Canada is starting, doubling non-U.S. exports within 10 years. 20 new trade deals on 4 continents. Major engagement with the European Union, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and partners across the Asia-Pacific. The goal, as policy analysts framed it, was for Canada to be resilient enough that it was better left alone and respected than forcefully embraced, like a hedgehog. Not aggressive, not provocative, simply too costly to push around. And now, because honest analysis demands it, here is the part of this story that doesn't get covered nearly enough: the real risks. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre dismissed much of Carney's agenda as a performance, shuffling papers, holding meetings, delivering nothing while Canadians lost jobs and couldn't afford groceries or housing. Independent policy analysts noted that while the language of the plan is genuinely ambitious, accelerating, mobilizing, catalyzing, supercharging, the execution requires a public service that is simultaneously being asked to do more and shrink its own footprint. That is a fundamental contradiction. You cannot fast-track $116 billion in major infrastructure projects if the civil servants responsible for approving them have been cut in an efficiency review. The Carney government is trying to grow the economy and reduce the size of government at the same time, and those two objectives will collide in the execution phase. There were diplomatic stumbles, too. Negotiations on sectoral tariffs appeared to be gaining momentum, until the province of Ontario ran an anti-tariff advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan during the World Series. Trump perceived it as interference in American political affairs, canceled the negotiations, and eliminated any near-term hope of tariff relief. Years of careful diplomatic groundwork undone in an afternoon. Carney's visit to the United Arab Emirates, seeking investment commitments in artificial intelligence, mining, and strategic industries, raised ethical concerns as well, given the UAE's documented involvement in Sudan's civil war. Critics noted the Prime Minister appeared to spend more time negotiating with authoritarian states than with the administration in Washington. And on the economic data itself, the picture is genuinely mixed. The Bank of Canada projected just 1.2% expansion for 2025. Canada's economy contracted for 2 consecutive months in the spring, largely due to oil sector disruptions. Unemployment climbed before retreating. In June 2025, Canada's unemployment rate unexpectedly dropped from 7.0% to 6.9% as the economy added 83,000 jobs, the first decline since January, despite ongoing U.S. tariffs. Non-U.S. exports, particularly gold and energy, helped offset the American shortfall. But the sectors most exposed to U.S. tariffs, manufacturing, auto parts, and agriculture, remained under serious stress. The headline, though, is this: Canada did not fall into recession. In the face of tariff shocks, diplomatic volatility, and a full-scale global trade war, the Canadian economy held. So what does all of this actually mean for Canada, for North America, and for how middle powers navigate a world where the old rules no longer apply? The Spring Economic Update 2026 built on the momentum of Budget 2025 with investments targeting productivity, competitiveness, and long-term growth. The government stated it was on track to mobilize over $1 trillion in investment over the 5-year window. The first and second tranches of major projects, representing more than $116 billion, were designed to unlock Canada's full resource potential and generate tens of thousands of high-paying jobs in sectors that didn't even exist at scale a decade ago. But here is the honest truth about where we are right now. This plan is ambitious enough to be called historic. The execution is complex enough to fail in a dozen different places. The geopolitical environment is volatile enough that everything could shift again before this video finishes loading. What is undeniable is that Canada has made a choice. A large, deliberate, painful, and strategically risky choice to stop being an economic tributary of the United States and start being something new. An energy superpower, a critical minerals leader, a trade hub with partners across 4 continents, a country that builds big things at speed and dares the world to underestimate it. The era of quiet Canadian dependence on American goodwill is over. Whether the $1 trillion actually moves, whether the mines get built, whether the LNG terminals reach Asian markets, whether the trade deals hold, whether the workers get retrained in time, whether the public service executes at the speed history is demanding, that is the defining question of Canadian politics for the next decade, and we will be tracking every piece of it, daily. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this matters. Not just for Canada, but for every country watching to see whether a middle power can actually break free from a dominant partner without breaking itself in the process. Drop your answer in the comments. Do you think Carney's plan succeeds, or does it collapse under the weight of its own ambition? The conversation happening down there is genuinely worth reading, and if you want daily breakdowns on the stories that are actually reshaping the global economy, the ones most channels are still sleeping on, subscribe. Not because we ask, but because you'll want to be here when the next chapter drops.